Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.
Hello and welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show which is keeping you in the loop, which is broadcast from Radio Kirkabashkeen in Kilkee on 94.8 FM. Unfortunately, Lorna cannot be with us this week, so for this week's show, it's myself, Owen Mulligan, alongside Alva Maddock and Garvin Keneally. And this week's show, we're looking at a theme which is following on from something we looked at briefly during our show on Ada English, which is looking at the history of asylums in Ireland, the social effects on those who were in the asylums, and also the lunacy laws of this period.
And I'd just like to add a disclaimer to the start of the episode that the topic that we're going to be discussing this week is quite a sensitive issue and that some listeners might find it distressing.
So, Alva, you have the kind of early period of the asylums in Ireland and the laws and such.
Yeah, so first of all, the reasoning behind asylums and the segregation of mental health patients was so the government could get involved with social reform. So dating back to as early as the 1700s, 1703, we have records of Dublin and Cork being one of the first places in Ireland to house so-called, I quote, lunatics or imbeciles. This would have been supported by the House of Industry, which was established in Dublin by the Act of Parliament in 1703 for the maintaining and employment of the poor. So the House of Industry, they established a hospital on the site of St. James's Hospital in Dublin in 1728, which included cells for incurable lunatics, as they called them. So they were separated from kind of the rest, everyone else, and this could be seen in like places such as prisons and workhouses as well as hospitals. So, and this carries on like right up until the early 1900s. I mean, you have on the census 1901 and 1911 census, the last columns on Form A is the column states, if deaf and dumb, dumb only, blind, imbecile, or idiot, or lunatic, kind of write down the illness in which they have opposite to the corresponding name. So, you mean you have this sort of stigma around it right up until then. And because the government were involved, there was so many acts that were introduced, 18 from between 1811 and 1901, which is a lot. And these included the Marriage of Lunatics Act, 1811, which prohibited lunatics from getting married. And this was only repealed in 2015, but obviously it has been used long time beforehand because, you know, our times have changed dramatically since then. Other acts include, you know, Lunatic Asylum Act, 1846, and the Dangerous Lunatic Act in 1838. And Owen Mulligan has more information on the Dangerous Lunatic Act in 1838.
Yeah, thank you, Alva. So the Dangerous Lunatic Act of 1838, it had been passed by Parliament without debate, so there was no really consideration given to the effects that this act would have on society. And the reasoning that it was put into place, the act had been considered unnecessary following the murder of Nathaniel Snyde, who was a bank director in July 1833 by a person with apparent mental illness. So there was an incidence of a murder. There was questions over, who had done the murder, but the Dangerous Lunatic Act followed that murder. And really, once that was put into place, it really increased dramatically, particularly in Ireland, the numbers of those who were put in asylums. And this was just only a couple of years before the famine struck Ireland. So, and to give you an example, in 1830 there were just 791 asylum beds. But 60 years later, in 1896, so 66 years later, this number had risen to 13,620. So the numbers had massively increased in 60 years. So again, you can see a really large increase in the numbers. So, initially the establishment of the asylums was welcomed by local clergy, gentry and judicial authorities. So people did feel there was a need that society should look out for those who had mental illness. But again, the Dangerous Lunatic Act was seen as something that could be interpreted in many ways, and its terms of confinement were significantly broad and vague, which allowed for a looser interpretation of those considered a danger to the wider public. And it is regarded, the Act of 1838, as the single biggest factor in the swelling of numbers in the mass institutionalisation which occurred in asylums in Ireland during the 19th century. There would have been some genuine factors which would have contributed to the pressures on asylums in the 19th century. So you would have had industrialisation and emigration, massive factors in the 1800s. And this would have reduced families' capacities to care for family members struggling with mental health. One of the other factors and statistics is that between 1871 and 1901, the records show that the most frequent age at which men and women were admitted to asylums was between the ages of 30 and 39. So really, when men and women are at the peak of able to contribute to society economically, socially, they are being put into the asylums. And as Alva said, the Marriage Act of 1811 prohibited those who were regarded as having mental illness from getting married. And often those who were admitted to asylums, if they were a single person and they were lucky enough to be released, the stigma of having been in an asylum would have really prevented them from marrying. And these would have had really dramatic effects socially on the kind of fabric of people who had been in the asylums and also their families. So the Ballinasloe district, which is actually where Dr. Ada English had worked from 1904, prior to her being there, but between 1871 and 1911, there was a 300% increase in the admission rates to the asylums. So there was a huge increase during that period. And again, we're really seeing how these factors are just really affecting people in really dramatic ways. By the turn of the 20th century in 1900, an approximate 21,000 people, which is 0.5% of the population, were accommodated in district asylums. This heavily crowded system became so large that by the mid-20th century, Ireland had more asylum beds per head of population than any other country in the world. There was also, some feelings and suspicions that there was links between doctors' pay and the size of the asylums, particularly in the late 19th century, which would have raised ethical questions about the validity of these asylums, which would have been overcrowded. So I suppose the sense that the more inpatients in the asylums, the larger the doctor's pay. So there would have been an incentive to have people put in the asylums. And really one of the stark statistics which illustrates the dominance of the asylum districts regionally can be found again in Ballinasloe in 1951. So the population of Ballinasloe at that time stood at 5,596, of which 2,078 were patients in the district asylum. That's a staggering number out of one area. And a lot of the attempts at reducing the number of inpatients in highly crowded mental hospitals were blocked due to the fact that these institutions were key regional employers. So there was an economic factor in having people in these asylums for the local economy and employment, and there would have been resistance to, I suppose, manage the asylums more effectively. And then, as Garvin has said, it is a very sensitive topic, and in the early 20th century there were definitely a number of treatments which were introduced which were highly problematic. So these would have included malarial therapy, insulin coma therapy, and the most dangerous of all, lobotomy. In stark contrast to 1900, in more recent times in 2015, there were less than 2,400 patients in inpatient psychiatric care. So there has been, a far better understanding. But during this period of the 19th century into the 20th century, a lot of the stigmatization and the kind of abandonment, really, of those with mental health struggles and illness would have been widespread throughout Ireland during that period. And Garvin has further information about the social and the institutional effects on those who would have been in the asylums.
Well, in the 19th and 20th century, it's generally said that there was an epidemic of asylums in Ireland. And at one point, 20,000 people were in the institutions being treated for mental illness. But according to the first published history of psychiatry in Ireland, it was not a problem with an epidemic of the amount of people with mental illness during the time. Instead, it was more a combination of social and institutional circumstances that led to a high number of patients being admitted and mistreated. Early asylums developed from prisons originally. Prison workhouses would have had sections called lunatic wards, or rooms or areas that they then eventually became freestanding asylums. Some of the practices in the asylums came from prisons rather than coming from a healthcare starting point. And this is one of the big issues when it comes to the topic of early mental health care institutions, where although there was definitely a movement towards seeing the affected people as a patient, the methodology used was still quite regressive and misinformed, and ultimately very harmful to patients. This meant that some patients were chained up while others were restrained in straitjackets. And a case example here of some of the institutional mistreatment was that in an asylum in Limerick that was particularly bad, where the inmates were chained with their hands under their knees and they weren't allowed to stand up. So when the inspectors came, they found these people were no longer able to stand up and likely would no longer be able to. And the first major asylum, the Richmond Asylum, or Grange Gorman, opened in 1814. Before this, people with mental illness were treated at home, in communities with often quite shocking and inhumane ways due to lack of community or government support. People with mental illnesses could end up living quite difficult and short lives. An inquiry in 1817 revealed that the most common way of treating people that family members had was that they would dig a pit in the ground in the hut or home and put the mentally ill person in there with a grid or grill across the top and simply just fed the person through the pit, which is, a really terrible and inhumane way of dealing with an issue such as mental health. Old pre-asylum methods of trying to deal with people with mental health issues outside of institutions often involved myths and folk legends. An example would be that it was said that the mentally ill could be cured by drinking water from the well at Glannagyalt in County Kerry. And also the madman's chair in Dunanny Point, County Louth, was a rock that if a mentally ill person sat down on it would be cured of their madness. And this is, obviously a regressive way of dealing with patients. The Dangerous Lunatic Act of 1838 also meant that someone could be committed to an asylum without medical opinion. It wasn't necessary to have a medical certificate in order for magistrates to commit someone to an asylum. All that was needed was that their opinion that somebody was likely to commit an offence. This led to families and communities beginning to use asylums in very specific ways and almost like abusing the system. So they would use it to remove mentally ill people or people with an intellectual disability or generally unwanted people from a family home. And some families even took part in what was called wintering in, where they would drop a person into the asylum at the start of winter to be fed in bed for the following months, and then leave them there until they need them back on the farm during the summer.
Okay, thank you very much, Garvin.
It's important to remember that, like, from a genealogy point of view, that patients in these asylums, hospitals, prisons, and workhouses, there's records of these people there. So, if one was to look back at their family ancestry to find out where these people were born, where they lived, where they died, these places have records of these people there. Might necessarily be much, but they would include name, age, and cause of death.
That's very interesting. And as you may remember from a previous, that really the earliest documents, records that we would have in Ireland are 1901 and 1911 census. Yeah. So we can't go back into the 19th century, even though there are censuses from 1821 and so forth. They're only partial records that we would have from that period. I also want to bring your attention to 2 journal articles which are very useful. One is called Myths, Madness and Insane Ears by Brendan Kelly from 2017. It's a fairly short journal article, and one that has a wealth of information is by Michael Finane. It's from 1979. It's called Insanity and the Insane in Post-Famine Ireland. It's over 450 pages long, so it's very long, but it has very good statistical information about the those who are put into the asylums. There's just a really good amount of information there, which is very, very useful. And moving slightly off topic, but for any of you that are interested in family history and archival documents, recently myself, Alva and Garvin, we registered with the National Archives of Ireland and the National Library of Ireland to get readers' tickets. It was free of charge, and the tickets, they both last for 3 years. So even for any listeners who may be listening from England, Canada, America, or further afield, it might be something that you might consider to find out, your national library or state library, or state archives, national archives, to get more information. You have that access, and with the Irish National Library and National Archives, as I say, it's free of charge. The tickets last 3 years. It's a reader's ticket, so it's something that you should maybe consider and look into. So that's all for this week's show. Do remember that there's a repeat broadcast on Sunday afternoons, and the show is also podcast out online. So from myself, Alva and Garvin, thank you very much for listening.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.